only 25 more to go. Here's a quick recap of some of the people who have made our list so far. Now there are only 25 people left, the top 25 of the millennium. Can you figure out who they are? Some of the choices may surprise you as we continue our countdown to number 1, biography's person of the millennium. He changed the world with a simple equation. Water plus heat equals steam. Number 25 on our list, Scottish inventor James Watt.
It doesn't surprise me at all that Watt is there. What's unfortunate is how few people even ever think of it.
You may have never heard of it, but this man is the godfather of the Industrial Revolution. Watt invented the first practical steam engine. He turned hot air into power, cheap power, and set off an explosion of manufacturing and business. Before steam, everything had been powered by people or animals, wind or water. The world moved at a leisurely pace. But steam set the machines running, and those machines transformed our world.
What Watt did was free us from being bound to build our manufacturing facilities next to waterways and let us put them anywhere. And it was with Watt's steam engines that commerce across the country was propagated.
Watt's invention fed the fires of the Industrial Revolution, a century and a half of breakneck growth. In the 20 years from 1780 to 1800 alone, the world's industrial output doubled, forever altering the lives of millions of people.
It ripped them out of their life in the village and created the working day, for a start. The notion that really work ought to be designed to accommodate itself to machines rather than to a kind of human tempo all happens with the Industrial Revolution.
Watt's invention and the revolution it spawned meant progress, but progress came at a heavy price for those who labored long hours in crowded and unsafe workplaces. For better or worse, James Watt propelled the Western world from a rural society to an industrial one. And modern life, you might even say he invented it. Cars, planes, phones, faxes, pollution, urban transit, the houses we live in, the stress we feel, every single mass-produced thing we buy. James Watt's invention set off the chain of events that created them all. Even his name has become a household word.
Watt really powered the Industrial Revolution with that steam engine, and it's very fitting that we label units of power as watts.
They were known as the Dark Ages, bleak years of poverty and ignorance, despair and death.
In the medieval times, life was basically short, brutish, and nasty. It was governed by superstition, it was governed by dogma. So we were in the land of myth and folklore, superstition and savagery.
But one man lit a light in this dark time. His name was St. Thomas Aquinas, master theologian and philosopher of the Middle Ages. When Aquinas decided to become a priest at the age of 18, his mother locked him in a castle for an entire year, hoping to change his mind. It didn't work. Legend has it, his brothers tried to lure him from his calling by tempting him with a prostitute. He drove her away with a burning cross. A bigger challenge to his faith came when he was a student at the University of Paris. There, scientific thinking was the rage. The Catholic Church saw that as a direct affront. They said unswerving obedience to God needed no logical proof. Aquinas' achievement was to bring these opposites together in one brilliant philosophical system. He showed that reason and faith can coexist. In fact, he said, curiosity and thought were divine gifts, so it made perfect sense to use our intellect to study God's creations. But Aquinas' philosophy continues to provoke debate to this day.
I don't care about Aquinas at all, actually. I don't care about Aquinas. I would strike him from the list. What you see in your daily life should make you question things spiritual and things metaphysical, not prevent you from questioning. So, I mean, Aquinas is, sort of an awful kind of big, scoutmaster, really, who tells you what the limits of knowledge should be.
The historically important figures in the history of philosophy are frequently those who synthesize important but seemingly opposed systems of thought. So when you come to Thomas's achievement, I mean, it's like a huge mountain there in the landscape of history. It's inescapable.
There are nearly 1 billion Catholics in the world, and they still rely on the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas. By bringing together the world of man and the world of God, Aquinas has shown them how to keep the faith. It was America's bloodiest chapter, the war that almost ripped apart a nation. This man bridged America's great divide and made it one nation, indivisible. Number 23 on our list, Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln's prevailing thought was one of, no, we are not going to allow this nation called the United States of America to divide itself, to diminish the greatness and the potential of what this land could be.
His life is the great American story. A poor boy from the backwoods of Kentucky with only a year's formal schooling, Lincoln taught himself the law. He became one of the most successful attorneys in Illinois and eventually president. But just a month after his inauguration in 1861, the South seceded from the Union and the Civil War began. For 4 bitter years, Lincoln would guide his country.
If you stop and think what would have happened if the South had prevailed, I mean, let's face it, they would have seceded from the Union. We would have had 2 countries, North and the South. They would have been at each other's throats forever. And it would have certainly doomed the United States of America.
The North wouldn't have won the Civil War if a lesser man had been president. A lesser man might have said, go ahead, create another country, we'll let you go. What Lincoln managed to do was to understand that the United States represented a larger idea.
Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, but it would be 2 more years before the Confederacy finally surrendered at Appomattox, Virginia in April of 1865. Less than a week later, Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington.
With Abraham Lincoln, his legacy is not simply that he won the Civil War. It's that he left behind a body of writing like the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural Address, which embodied American principles forever.
To this day, his speeches resonate, and it's no wonder. Lincoln used to drive his aides crazy rehearsing every word aloud. His Gettysburg Address remains one of the best-known 3 minutes in American history. The lines still touch us, and so do the ideals. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Lincoln's greatest legacy is the preservation of the Union and the creation of the modern notion of American life. That blacks are going to be included, we're going to be one nation, and slavery is unacceptable on the American continent.
Is Louis XIV on your list? He's not? Huh. I mean, that's your decision, but he was the Sun King. Are any Chinese emperors on your list, other than Emperor Mao? No, of course not, but they ruled a quarter of the earth at one time.
They came thundering across the plains of Asia, the most savage conquerors in history. The Mongol hordes, led by number 22 on our list, Genghis Khan. Khan was lucky to have made it past adolescence. When he was a boy, enemies poisoned his father and banished him. But the young man had a gift for politics and war. The greatest joy, he proclaimed, is to conquer one's enemies, to see their families in tears, to ride their horses and to possess their daughters and wives. In time, Genghis Khan would become the most powerful man in the world, taking over almost half the known planet. To this day, his Mongol kingdom remains the largest land empire in history.
Genghis Khan is a classic example of someone about whom there's not a lot to say, because it's influence as extermination, I guess. How much can you say about impaling people, you know, really?
Genghis Khan was the master of the blitzkrieg. You know, his difference was he used cavalry and horses and the Mongol hordes, and he was a dominating military force. I'm not too sure his opposition was that good.
We may remember Genghis Khan for his brutal military exploits, but in truth, his legacy is far more significant.
Genghis Khan is important not just as a military figure, but as an empire builder. He creates the first real expansive, powerful empire. And up until the end of this millennium, empires were the driving force of political and social structure.
The Mongol Empire gave rise to a great flowering of Eastern culture, an enormous legacy of art, literature, law, and political thought.
You know, where you stand, as the saying goes, depends on where you sit. I mean, the rest of the world see him as a violent warrior, but the Mongolians see him as somebody who unified their nation, who really promoted openness and trade. So you have the two sides of Genghis Khan.
I think in the West, there's no question that the most influential politician as seen from today, remember that 1,000 years is a long time, is Washington.
You could say this man created America. Our first president, the man who slept just about everywhere, George Washington.
Washington was literally the father of the country. Washington personified what America became. He personified the presidency. He personified the sense of democratic life in a republic.
George Washington was the glue that held so much of it together. You know, his extraordinary perseverance and dignity in the face of defeats in the Revolutionary War, and then his insistence that he would not be part of creating an imperial ruling class, and the way he carried out the presidency is an extraordinary example of real grace and humility.
Even today, Washington is everywhere. On Mount Rushmore, in the names of colleges, and of course, on the dollar bill. But he never seems to be smiling. His poorly fitting dentures, made not of wood but hippopotamus tusk, inflicted almost constant pain.
It's so interesting, all those portraits of George Washington. It's impossible to figure out what he looked like. In some of those portraits, he's just this enormous creature, you know, Mr. Leader. And then other ones, he's like this small man. But George Washington, you have the sense that he was a great leader and somebody who sort of put their money where their mouth was.
In 1775, Washington led a ragtag mob of colonial soldiers against highly trained British forces and won. He could have made himself dictator, even king. Instead, he retired to his Mount Vernon plantation in Virginia. It was only when the young republic began to founder that Washington was called back to serve as our first president. Over the next 8 years, his impact was immeasurable. And he may be just as important for what he didn't do as what he did.
Usually, when people leave power, they leave flat. They're carried out of power after they've been killed or died. And Washington was really the first great leader who said, I am subordinate to the people, and after 2 terms as president, I will walk out of the White House. You can't have a democracy without peaceful transfer of power. And George Washington is the man who created the whole notion.
Washington's legacy was a nation, our nation, and his influence, his model, would ripple around the world. Number 20 was a contemporary of George Washington. He was an absent-minded man who frequently mumbled to himself. But Scottish writer Adam Smith would redefine the way we think about money. In 1776, the year of the American Revolution, Smith set off another kind of revolution when he published The Wealth of Nations. This pioneering book spelled out for the very first time how the world's economy works. Distribution of wealth, division of labor. Smith was so insightful, within a few decades, every other school of economic thought had been all but abandoned. His biggest contribution may have been separating economics from politics. He said that government should keep its hands off business. He called this theory laissez-faire, French for let it alone.
It's the idea that an economy will organize itself, that you really produce a better outcome for almost everybody by letting people look to their own self-interest. So, for example, if you go into a city, it looks as if nobody's in charge, but lo and behold, you go into a butcher store and there's meat there. You go into a bank and you can get money. And it's been organized by Adam Smith's invisible hand.
Adam Smith's legacy was the theory of free trade. It was a novel concept then. Now it's part of our lives. That's why, to this day, Smith's name is synonymous with capitalism. Here's a recap of our countdown of the 100 most influential people of the millennium. He was always complaining. Painting and sculpture have been my ruin, he wrote. I would have been better off making matches. But few artists have created more memorable images than Michelangelo, divine light of the Renaissance.
Artists influence our lives because of a burning image. And you don't have to even know the artist, but they're images that burn into our consciousness.
Michelangelo was already creating images of transcendent beauty at a very young age. His Pietà was completed when he was only 25. And he was only 29 when he transformed the discarded hunk of marble into his most famous sculpture.
The David is this vulnerable young boy looking at his fate and the fate of his people. It was carved out of a totally flawed piece of Carrara marble that had been brought down to Florence at great expense. He just went, he attacked it and delivered. He sculpted out the flaw and delivered this figure, which is the patron saint of Florence.
Michelangelo agonized over his works and often failed to complete them. He would spend more than 4 years on his back, meticulously painting the ceiling of Rome's Sistine Chapel. He argued constantly with his benefactors over his artistic vision. In a scene from the film The Agony and the Ecstasy, Charlton Heston, as Michelangelo, clashed with Pope Julius II over his depiction of the human body.
I will paint man as God made him, in the glory of his nakedness.
Michelangelo persisted, and when he finally finished, it was like the hand of God reaching across the centuries. Today, that celestial spark still touches us.
I'm not an art historian or even anyone qualified to judge art, but I can tell you that walking around in St. Peter's Basilica and looking at the Pietà was one of the most moving experiences I've ever had, because Michelangelo managed to pull humanity out of cold marble. It's so hard to imagine that anyone has such a gift to create life from cold stone.
Michelangelo lived to be 89. His last years were spent designing St. Peter's Church. Its distinctive dome would be widely copied around the world. He died with the work unfinished, perfectionist to the end.
I think Locke has to be in your top 100 list. Locke is an inescapable figure of the past 1,000 years.
This man didn't publish a word until he was almost 60. But when he did, he laid the foundation for constitutional democracy. John Locke, number 18 on our list, expressed almost all the major ideas of the American Revolution nearly a century before it happened.
Inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was Locke's schedule of human rights. Here in America particularly, Locke was a profoundly influential thinker.
Locke appeals to the best in us, and he thinks that human beings really can make the world better, that we can run a good, decent, fair society, that you can trust human beings to come up with the best answers. No one in the whole history of philosophy or political theory has ever put forward quite so straightforwardly cheery a view.
Locke's optimism, his faith, lay in the common man. He rejected the divine right of kings. Rather, he said the divine right is within each and every one of us.
Subjects can rebel if they don't like what the king is doing, which is a repudiation of the absolute model that power went from God to the king and then was loaned to you. This became God, power goes from God to you, and then you loan it to the state. It's a radically different model and is the base of all the modern political system.
Mr. Cecil Walker
Locke proposed a system of government based on human rights.
has not been removed in Northern Ireland.
He also championed religious freedom and separation of church and state. If it all sounds familiar, that's because his influence is still felt, not just in our Constitution and Bill of Rights, but in representative governments worldwide. He was just one man, a soft-spoken man, yet he took on the mightiest empire on earth. And in a battle without guns or swords, he prevailed, leading his country to independence. Mahatma Gandhi, without question, one of the most remarkable leaders of the millennium.
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace. It is complete independence that we want.
Mahatma means great soul, and no one deserved the title more than this deeply pious man. Gandhi, the son of a wealthy merchant family, studied in England to become a lawyer. On his return to India, he set out to use the British legal system against itself to gain freedom for his people. His weapon was non-violent civil disobedience.
We must remember that this has been the most brutal and the most violent century in terms of wars. We lived through 2 major wars. We've had all these conflicts around us, and then here comes up someone who says, you don't have to fight to win. And that with reason, with compassion, with determination, you can get your cause across. And I think that was a very powerful message.
Gandhi adopted the ways of the peasant class, eating little and making the thread for his clothes on a simple spinning wheel that's now a symbol on the flag of India. He fought for freedom from the British with an ingenious array of peaceful tactics, strikes and boycotts and mass arrests that clogged India's jails. A march to the sea protested a punishing tax on salt. When Gandhi reached an impasse, he would begin a fast, starving himself as a cleansing ritual, but also using the threat of his death to increase pressure on the British. His gentle defiance awoke the conscience of the world and signaled the beginning of the end of Britain's vast colonial empire. In 1947, Gandhi finally achieved his dream of freedom for India, but it came at a terrible price. Mob violence between warring Hindus and Muslims racked the new nation. And in January 1948, the simple man of peace was gunned down by a religious fanatic. Yet his life and his death sowed the seeds for a new generation of idealists.
Martin Luther King learned a lot from Gandhi's approach, Gandhi's struggle, using reason, his voice, his arguments, and reaching out to the people and giving them hope.
Perhaps the martyred men of principle will leave more of a legacy through their ideas than the men of power like Mao and Stalin, who rule with an iron fist, but they leave nothing behind. So in the end, it is the leaders of great principle that live on.
Es lebe die nationalsozialistische Bewegung! Es lebe Deutschland!
It is one of the ironies of our list that a saintly man like Mahatma Gandhi should be followed by the madman of the millennium, Adolf Hitler, number 16.
Hitler was a maniac and a killer, but he transformed his century in an absolutely fundamental way. He overthrew practically the entire European system. He's responsible for the decline of Europe as the center of world events.
He was the demon seed of a Germany reeling from defeat in World War I. Adolf Hitler rose from the gutter to become the most ruthless dictator in history. He was charismatic and clever, expert at both strong-arm tactics and subtle political maneuvering. But it was his skillful use of propaganda that propelled Hitler to power.
Ein Volk, ein Führer, ein Land, ein Land.
Most Germans are embarrassed that he ever existed, find no explanation how it was possible that an Austrian who never held a job in his life becomes unquestioned ruler of Germany. It is an aberration. It is a madman who got hold of a government.
The amazing thing was how close this man came to world domination. It would take an unparalleled alliance of powers to turn the tide of World War II. But not before Hitler had wreaked a horror that chills us still. Never before had someone tried so consciously and systematically to wipe an entire race off the face of the earth.
He committed unspeakable crimes for no purpose except to serve his own prejudices. Why people were killed in the gas chambers, for that there's no realistic explanation. One doesn't even know why he hated the Jews so much.
You can make a very strong case, and I say this with the greatest reluctance, that the most influential person in the century that's now drawing to a close has been the most evil person the century produced. What Adolf Hitler did can never be erased. 50 million people died because of him. The worst kind of Holocaust was perpetrated on the Jewish people and many other peoples. And the legacy of it lives on even today in places like Bosnia and Kosovo and other parts of the world.
He was one of the most brilliant men of the millennium, an educator, philosopher, architect, and inventor. Thomas Jefferson wrote his way into the history books.
He isn't on your list because he was the third president of the United States. He's on your list because he wrote the Declaration of Independence with its enduring message about the equality of all people.
Jefferson was the author of those stirring words, that all men are created equal and that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And that in itself was an extraordinary statement of principle. Now, given the circumstances of the time, I think that it is fair to say that at least the vast majority of the founders saw only white men as part of that call for liberty. They viewed women as their property, and they wrote off large segments of the population, whether they be Native Americans or black slaves. But nevertheless, those words set into motion a chain of events that we are still seeing the results of today.
He's honored as one of our founding fathers, but in his day, critics called him a democratic dreamer, a philosopher who would never get things done. Then he single-handedly doubled the size of America with the Louisiana Purchase. All his life, Jefferson would embody such contradictions. He was an eloquent spokesman for freedom and liberty, but also a slave owner. Recent DNA evidence has confirmed what some historians have suspected for years. Jefferson had a long-term relationship with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings.
It's something that has caused a great amount of concern in America because there was some question about whether or not a man who was involved with a black person in this fashion for 38 years could be the personification of America. And I think the new revelations will make us rethink not only what we think about Jefferson, but ourselves.
What's important to know is there was slavery in this country. There's no way to whitewash that. That was here. You know, like the Holocaust, it happened. And a man like Jefferson, of course that happened. Does it undermine him as a man? Yes, it does. But that's who this country was. That's our tragedy.
In his final years, Thomas Jefferson never lost sight of his ideals. And even in his death, he reminded us of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
To fully understand how inextricably involved Jefferson was with his manifesto, he died on the 4th of July. He died on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It's almost like he was placed here to write that manifesto, to implement that manifesto, and once his duty was done, he left us.
Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow.
There was a time in the early 19th century when experts suggested the U.S. government should shut down its patent office. There was nothing left to invent, or so they thought. Then along came number 14 on our list, the Wizard of Menlo Park, Thomas Edison.
Well, Thomas Edison invented an enormous number of things, more so than even somebody like Bell. Edison had a diversity of interests. He looked at problems and saw solutions.
We learned several things from Edison. One of them is that if you don't have to sleep, it helps because you can get a lot more work done, and he didn't seem to sleep very much, if at all. Second, the man's persistence paid off. He managed to try every possible thing out, and then he documented it all and filed it away in the patent office. Such discipline.
While Edison had only 3 months of formal education, he would be granted more patents than any person in American history. 1,093. They include the phonograph, the stock ticker, and the alkaline storage battery. But one invention was his greatest of all. On New Year's Eve, 1879, Edison flipped a switch and everything changed. The electric light gave us illumination around the clock. It gave us more hours in the day, more time to read, work, and play. Edison would go on to develop the electrical system that would power his masterpiece of tungsten and glass. And that was just the beginning. In 1888, he invented the kinetoscope, the first motion picture machine. He added sound in 1913 and gave birth to an industry.
The first motion picture studio ever set up in the world was in the yard of my laboratory at West Orange.
The thing that I guess I'm most grateful for Thomas Edison for is the invention of the motion picture. Light and shadow and projecting against a wall, and you can go back and say, well, the electric light bulb was the greatest thing he ever invented, and of course without that there wouldn't be an industry for motion picture production, but you know, he really made the first American movies, and I think all of us kind of look at him in this industry with a great deal of gratitude.
Edison's creativity and productivity gave rise to businesses that at his death were worth more than $25 billion. That's equal to $300 billion today. You could say Edison had the most valuable brain in history. But despite his tremendous success, Edison was a man of the people. He never tired of trading wisecracks with reporters.
How does it feel to be 84 years old?
Well, I have a little trouble now and then, and that's because I'm getting old. But I've got a lot of ginger yet.
Edison lit up the world. When he died in 1931, electric lights across America were dimmed in his honor.
I don't know whether if I was sitting here in the year 3000 and someone said to me, do you think Bill Gates should be in the top 5 of this millennium because of the information revolution? I don't know, you know, but I won't be here then, so it's not my problem.
Never came to mind. He believed that dreams, random thoughts, even jokes could reveal the fears and fantasies that ripple through our lives.
What he has given us is crucial, this genius of saying, don't take people just at their face value. Find out what their relationship was with their parents, with their siblings. Talk about jealousy. Talk about all of those emotions.
In his case studies, Freud looked into the depths of the human psyche. What he found there time and again were primal drives like sex and aggression.
Freud's view of women and inner space and outer space, and that your entire life is determined, frankly, by your womb or, you know, or by your genitals, I find totally confounding. It's an idea that hit and changed the world and should definitely be on your list, whether I agree with it or not. You know, some days you go to therapy and think, oh, please, God, let this be true. I just hope this man knew what he was talking about and it's all fixable.
Today, when we talk about ourselves, we use Freud's words: ego, libido, Oedipus complex. For even now, it is Freud's map that guides us through the most secret world of all, the complicated landscape of the human mind.
If you were to read Freud now, you would look up and say, well, everybody knows this. But nobody knew it. Only he knew it.
So what we have to say today is thank you, Sigmund Freud, for being a pioneer and for helping people like myself to gain that knowledge about sexuality.
He is the original Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci, painter, inventor, and scientist extraordinaire. Leonardo was one of the most prolific geniuses of all time, yet some of our experts think his achievements are overrated.
Leonardo da Vinci, whom you have in your list, is a wonderful mind, a wonderful figure, someone who we all admire, but I don't think that he really helped change the world.
I mean, I just think that having two Renaissance is kind of amusing, and no medieval, no Greek artists, for Pete's sake. Tell your experts to get less tired. Get some sleep. Go on a vacation.
Still, when all the votes were tallied, Leonardo da Vinci earned a place near the top of our Millennium countdown. For you could say he invented the modern idea of the artist as visionary. Leonardo was the illegitimate son of a peasant girl and a Florentine notary. But what he lacked in paternity, he made up for in curiosity. Although we think of him as a painter, there are surprisingly few finished paintings by Leonardo. Yet his works, including the extraordinary Last Supper and the Mona Lisa, would have a profound influence down through the ages.
The Mona Lisa has a significance in history which may outweigh some of its merits as art. It is painted beautifully. I mean, it's an extraordinary picture. But there's no question that the Mona Lisa, for many people, represents art with a capital A.
But Da Vinci's greatest contribution may have nothing to do with art, for as a scientist, he towered over his contemporaries. He was ahead of his time in engineering, anatomy, hydraulics, and aerodynamics, to name but a few. He had a keen eye for the way things work, the circulation of the blood, the effect of the moon on tides. He designed literally thousands of things, from submarines to airplanes. Most were never built in his time, but they still inspire us today.
A great deal of what we have of Leonardo is ideas, sketches, notebooks, unbelievably clear insights and observations of nature, aerodynamics, hydrodynamics. He invented the first helicopter on paper but didn't make it. He sort of rethought the world.
Centuries would pass before his ideas took wing, and it would take even longer for us to understand all the concepts in his notebooks. Today, Leonardo stands as an icon, a visionary peering across the years. Yet, ironically, this man so famous for the precision of his observation was himself little observed, little known. Like his famous painting, he remains an enigma to this day.
There stands Leonardo as the sort of quintessential definition of the genius, the man who could do everything and about whom there is a kind of mystery that is insolvable.
Once you got the top 20, how in the world do you rank order them? I mean, how do you compare the person who discovers penicillin with the person who writes the Declaration of Independence?
See the world run. Run, world, run. Run. See Texaco run. Visualize, hypothesize, explore, and relentlessly search and find the energy the world needs to run. Run, world, run. Texaco, a world of energy.
Owens Corning presents Siding Beauty. One day, a princess, a beautiful princess, who lived in a beautiful castle clad in beautiful Owens Corning siding, fell asleep under a witch's curse. Until awakened by a handsome prince many, many years later.
It can't be many, many years later. Look at that beautiful siding.
Take a look.
Whoa.
For the full story on all our exterior systems, call us or visit owenscorning.com today. Owens Corning, the stuff dream homes are made of.
He was America's favorite family man, but behind the happy face lived a loner
He keeps things pushed down inside.
who no one really knew.
He was drinking every night.
Until personal triumphs became an inspiration to all.
That's my story.
Dick Van Dyke on an all-new biography special. Sunday at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific on A&E.
Now I had the time of my life. No, I never felt this way before.
Had the time of my life, and I owe it all to you.
I've been waiting for so long. Now I finally found someone to stand by me.
We saw the writing on the wall as we felt this magical fantasy. I've had the time of my life, and I owe it all to you. I've had the time of my life, and I owe it all to you.
save $555. Call your travel agent or 1-800-SANDALS.
You're watching Biography of the Millennium on A&E. Welcome back to the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England. Well, we have made it to the final 10. The 10 people who have had the greatest impact on the last 1,000 years. In a way, they're all explorers, for each set their sights on a distant frontier. But when it comes to their actual professions, it may not surprise you that half of them are scientists. For if the past millennium is marked by anything, it is the fact that scientific discovery is the single greatest agent of change on the planet. One man who transformed the way we think about ourselves and the planet we live on is number 10 on our list, Italian astronomer and physicist Galileo Galilei. Galileo was a confident, even arrogant man with a flair for the dramatic. And what he discovered was dramatic. The science of modern astronomy. Galileo took the newly fashioned telescope, reinvented it, and pointed it toward the sky.
And he saw things that no one before him had seen. The moon was thought to be a perfectly spherical orb in the sky, divinely made. He found blemishes on it. These discoveries were so profound that the establishment presupposed that Galileo's telescope was some kind of sorcery that he had cooked up just to undermine the authority of the church.
Galileo shattered the notion that the Earth was the center of the universe. Instead, he said, planets circle the sun. At the time, it was a shocking theory, for everyone believed in an Earth-centered galaxy. Not only that, it was fundamental to church doctrine.
If God said we're special and he created us specially, why would he put us on any other part of the universe except its center? Once you shake that notion, you've challenged something very fundamental.
Galileo was hauled before the Inquisition in Rome and charged with heresy. Old and ill, he nonetheless made a stirring defense for the truth.
People ask, well, isn't what you say about the universe, doesn't it conflict with the Bible? And he said, the Bible tells you how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go.
But the church was not amused, and Galileo was forced to repudiate his claims. He spent the last 9 years of his life under house arrest, the price he paid for being ahead of his time. Today, Galileo stands as a symbol for freedom of thought and an emblem of the battle against authority, a battle he eventually won. For the Vatican finally acknowledged that it had wronged the Italian astronomer, but not until 1992. Galileo followed in the footsteps of a man who revolutionized our understanding of the solar system in his spare time. Nicholas Copernicus was never a professional astronomer. He worked most of his life as a church administrator in his native Poland. But what he accomplished in his off hours laid the foundation for everything we know about the galaxy.
Copernicus was the first scientist to actually come up with a mind-blowing idea that then took hold and forced the world to rethink our position in the universe.
Copernicus lived a century before Galileo, so he had no telescope to work with. Using only the naked eye and crude instruments, he dreamed up the theory that Galileo would one day prove. Copernicus theorized that the Earth and all the planets move, that our world rotates on its axis every 24 hours to make a day, that it completes an orbit around the sun in a year. It was at the time a ridiculous notion that just turned out to be right.
It gives us contemporary astronomy. It takes us from an Earth-centered system to a planetary system. And boy, that's a leap.
A leap both physical and metaphysical.
If you believe you're the center of the universe, it's a metaphor for all sorts of godlike presuppositions about ourselves. Then the question is, if you're not the center of the universe, what are you? Who are you, where are you located, and what is the universe? And those are the questions we've been dealing with ever since.
Copernicus realized the radical and explosive nature of his theories, and he kept them to himself for almost 30 years. Colleagues finally persuaded him to publish. Legend has it, the first copy was presented to him on his deathbed.
Very few people, other than other mathematicians and a number of astronomers, are even aware of what he's done or even terribly interested. It's not really till Galileo comes along that the idea becomes the heart of an entirely new system and then really begins to take hold.
The complex vision of the universe theorized by Copernicus wouldn't be fully accepted for another 200 years, but it would eventually take man to the moon and beyond, and inspire the generations of scientists who followed. One of those scientists is this man, the father of the nuclear age, number 8 on our list, Albert Einstein.
Albert Einstein is to the modern era what Galileo was in the Renaissance. And that's why I put them very close together. Maybe Einstein just a notch above.
He couldn't speak fluently until he was 9. He was a mediocre student who cut classes and dropped out of high school. But by the age of 26, Einstein published his remarkable theory of relativity.
Separate, fission. I'm always fascinated by Einstein. I'm fascinated by that man. My favorite picture of Einstein is the one where
he was a man of great simplicity, high informality. If he was the greatest scientist ever lived, I wouldn't dare to say, but he was certainly, if you want to name 5, I would count him in, of all times.
E stands for energy, M for mass, and c squared is the speed of light multiplied by itself. Now, c squared is a very great number, and so, if multiplied by even a small mass, the result will be a very great amount of energy.
In 1905, Einstein published his 3 seminal papers on light, gravity, and the laws of motion. The centerpiece was the theory of relativity, which laid down a mind-bending new definition of space and time.
When Einstein came up and said, you know something, when you travel faster, time slows down, mass increases. You could go away and come back, and you'll be younger than your twin sister. You say, that doesn't make sense. You know something? It doesn't make sense to anybody, and it doesn't have to. You have to put on a different hat that abandons your common sense.
Commonsensical or not, the ramifications of Einstein's theories were stunning. They unlock the infinite potential of the atom for both creation and total destruction. Einstein, a longtime pacifist, was afraid of what his work might inspire and appalled by the rise of a new leader in his native land, Adolf Hitler. Einstein left Germany for the United States in 1933. The Nazis gathered a group of scientists who attacked his theory and labeled it Jew science. If I were wrong, Einstein reportedly said, one professor would have been enough. In 1939, in a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, Einstein urged watchfulness and, if necessary, quick action to beat Germany to the atomic bomb. FDR secretly set up a team to develop atomic weapons, a team without Einstein.
He was totally uninvolved in the development of the bomb. He did not even know what was happening. When he heard after Hiroshima what had happened, he said, "Oy vey," which means, oh my God. He was shocked.
The nuclear age had begun, and Einstein was deeply concerned about where it would lead.
It was a weird thing. He knew that this was Pandora's molecule, the manifestation of what we've been living under the fear of for the last 50 years. We're still living with the fact of who has a nuclear bomb.
In his later years, Einstein worked for international peace and the creation of a Jewish state. In fact, he was offered the presidency of Israel in 1952. He declined the honor, Yet famed playwright George Bernard Shaw still gave him sovereignty over the entire universe.
Ptolemy made a universe which lasted 1,400 years. Newton also made a universe which has lasted 300 years. Einstein has made a universe, and I can't tell you how long that will last.
It's okay, I agree about him. There's no doubt that Karl Marx, as a thinker, as a social analyst, is certainly among the most influential figures of the last century, whether you like it or not. The perversion of his thought led to millions and millions of deaths. But when you talk about importance, you're not talking only about milk and honey.
Karl Marx was a German scholar and editor. He barely earned enough to support his family, and 3 of his 6 children died in childhood. To him, the world was unjust and ruled by the capitalist upper class. Workers work and the bosses get rich. Marx believed the working class would one day rise up to take their fair share. He hoped they would create a utopian society in which money would be equally divided and no one would be hungry or ignorant. In the mid-19th century, Marx's ideas were revolutionary. His 2 groundbreaking works were the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, co-written with Friedrich Engels.
No one ever read his epic work, Das Kapital. It's unreadable and dense, and it's an economic theory which doesn't apply to the world today and barely applied when he wrote it. But he hit the mood that came after the revolutions of 1848 perfectly with his one phrase, workers of the world unite. There's something more important than what nation you're part of, and that is your class. Workers are being oppressed similarly everywhere. And this simple idea took hold, and the international movements were formed.
It would be nearly 70 years before Marx's theories actually took root, adapted by leaders like Vladimir Lenin in his 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. Communism spread across the Eastern Bloc from the newly formed Soviet Union, setting the stage for the most enduring conflict of the 20th century, the Cold War. At its peak, 1 billion people lived under communism, more than any other political system in history. But with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 and the collapse of communist regimes throughout Europe, Marx's vision of a worldwide workers' revolution now seems at best a utopian ideal that went wrong, and at worst, an abject failure.
If you analyze the great revolutions, which were primarily Russia and China, a few others, you can see that they never were true Marxists. In the end, communism was a real dictatorship theory, not an economic theory, and it failed because the economic part of it was completely wrong.
Well, it's very easy to dismiss Marx wholesale because of the slaughter that took place in his name. His analysis of relations between workers and owners, his analysis of many things, was in fact very often a work of genius. Marx is part of us, whether we like it or not.
Christopher Columbus deserves to be on the list because he opened up the Americas and created the world that we know. He's controversial because of the introduction of slavery into the Americas, the decimation of the Native American populations can be traced to Columbus.
Christopher Columbus, Italian navigator, discoverer of the New World. Few people on our list are quite so controversial. For his is a story of courage and a series of blunders. Columbus believed the world was almost all land. He headed the wrong way, miscalculated by 8,000 miles, and ended up in the wrong location. And yet his magnificent discovery would transform our planet. By the mid-15th century, when the Ottoman Empire closed off access to the riches of Asia, Columbus speculated that the Orient could be reached by sailing not east at all, but west.
He's a mystic, you know. He's sort of half genius, half crackpot. I mean, he believes, of course, he's finding the East, not the West. He's finding the Indies.
At the time, most mariners believed the Earth was much smaller than it actually is. Yet they were certain that Columbus's plan would end in disaster. After 6 years, Columbus finally persuaded Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to finance his journey. Columbus set off in 1492 on the first of 4 voyages west. He would sight virtually every island of the Caribbean, travel along Central America, and be credited as the first Westerner to lay eyes on the South American continent. He was also the advance guard for the creation of a mighty Spanish empire that would dominate the New World for more than a century.
Columbus spread the culture of Europe to the Americas. He didn't discover America, but part of the theme of this millennium is the growing influence of European culture around the world, and Columbus is one of the most important players in that process.
America was extraordinarily important to Europe because it created a sense of openness, of growth, of opportunity, which led to an extraordinary explosion of energy. And as Europeans conquered larger and larger areas, it led to a sense of confidence, which became one of the hallmarks of European civilization.
While Europeans benefited from the opening of the New World, those who lived there paid a terrible price. Within 4 years of Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean, his men had killed or enslaved 1/3 of the native Taíno Indians on the island of Hispaniola. Columbus's Spanish patrons were delighted with the new lands he conquered, but uneasy with the many reports of brutality against the natives.
When he gets to the New World, Spanish crown is rather upset about the way he behaves. So as an angel of good and an angel of horror, it's all him.
In the century of Spanish dominion after Columbus, millions of New World natives would be slaughtered or die of disease brought by their conquerors, and the slave trade would usher in centuries of misery and humiliation. Yet, if this millennium is marked by the rise of European civilization, then we must credit Columbus as its catalyst. Misguided, perhaps, but brave nevertheless, carrying the flag into the unknown.
Let's look real quickly. We're just checking our lists. Joan of Arc, please, no smoking. Bill Gates, raise your right hand, your other right hand. Sigmund Freud, if it's not one thing, it's your mother. Karl Marx. You can always be a Marxist. Don't be afraid to say communism fell, and now the Iron Curtain is a drape.
If this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter, oh God.
I would put Shakespeare very high on the list because the soul of mankind matters as much as the science of the universe, and Shakespeare held the soul of mankind in his hands.
He is the world's most famous writer, and yet we know very little about him. William Shakespeare, number 5, would have appreciated that irony. Few artists had such a subtle grasp of the human heart and such a rich command of the tales he wove.
One is tempted to say that Shakespeare was the greatest writer who ever lived or ever could live, because it's almost unimaginable that the wits of the genius could ever be matched again. He's an extraordinary constructor of plots, extraordinary psychologist, a great myth maker, but the language above all, I suppose, is what establishes him as just the leading writer of the world, to me.
He came to London from the English countryside, and by 1592 he was crafting a successful career as an actor, author, and poet. His performances took him from the stage of the Globe Theatre to the court of Queen Elizabeth. He captivated audiences, although at the time he was considered an untutored genius, a little rough around the edges. A century later, the full measure of his achievement would be acknowledged. For in some 154 sonnets and 38 plays, through Othello and Lear and Richard III, Shakespeare created a timeless dramatic mirror of the way we live.
When we see a young man incapable of making a decision, an important decision, we think Hamlet. When we see an old man who is turned upon by his children and feels that his life has been worthless, we think of Lear. When we think of lovers, we think of Romeo and Juliet, and so on and so on and so on. You cannot name another writer who has created the models for the way we think as Shakespeare.
Today, the works of Shakespeare are performed more than any other playwright. His plays are transformed into musicals, operas, ballets, and of course, movies, for they are the inspiration we return to again and again.
I suppose if someone could name me a film that didn't draw directly from Shakespeare, I would think that that person was the next William Shakespeare. Because I think every plot, every story that anyone tells pretty much falls in step with the plots that Shakespeare invented. All of us, you know, have William Shakespeare to thank.
Shakespeare's works invite imitation. They almost beg for it.
Two Gentlemen of Malibu. Have you ever heard that one? It's, oh, yet this simple wave will break slowly, yet not knowing why. Oh, boogie on, this not knowing this thing. I do call thee friend, wax my board, and not know who thee are. Oh, gentle Richard, would that I had not known why. I don't care. It'd be great to think if Shakespeare could write Richard IV, you know. I'm not willing, trapped before my time, sent undine and not knowing. Ill laughed, and they do laugh at my shadow. I am not a crook, yet knowing this, I will splice until dawn and walk towards the copter unknown.
The richness of Shakespeare's inspiration, the complexity of his works, has led some people to ask, how could the son of a glove maker who never traveled beyond England be the author of such exquisite words? Some claim that Shakespeare was a front for a man of more noble birth who wished to be anonymous. One of the suspects is our number 38, Sir Francis Bacon.
Well, they also think it's not just Francis Bacon. It's like, or the Earl of Oxford, you know. There's a huge debate about that. I mean, here's the deal. You basically think of, you know, at that time, look in the plays. There's incredible references in Latin, Greek, travel. I mean, the scope is global. And yet, you know, it's, if you think of its will, just wandering around, knocking on doors in Stratford, going, is this to be or not to be?
But in the end, perhaps it really doesn't matter who wrote Shakespeare's words, for they are powerful and they endure.
Those plays, what are they, 500 years old now, continue to work, and they continue to work visually, theatrically, and personally. You know, Hamlet, we know exactly who that is. And Lear, and also that range of what it is to be young and narcissistic and self-indulgent and what it is to be old and knowing it's over, and to be able to touch the heart that deeply.
Will Shakespeare live on forever? Yes, Shakespeare, you know, will certainly live beyond, I think, most of the people on this list.
He trained to be a doctor, but couldn't stand watching surgery. He studied to be a clergyman, but that didn't work out either. Instead, he ended up shocking the world with an idea, an hypothesis of where we all come from. Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution.
In spite of my formal training in physics and my love of Galileo and Copernicus, I might just put Charles Darwin a notch above each of them. Because the Darwinian evolution affects human beings and the knowledge of where we came from much more directly than Galileo or even Copernicus or Einstein.
It was a discovery that almost didn't happen. When the British Royal Navy planned a scientific expedition, Darwin was offered a position as naturalist. His father didn't want him to go. The captain wasn't eager to have him along either. But at the last minute, Darwin went aboard. As the HMS Beagle traveled down the coast of South America, the young man marveled at the incredible variety of plants and animals he saw.
Here was an individual who fundamentally looked at the world. He didn't have elaborate instrumentation. He wasn't looking out at the stars. He wasn't looking with a microscope into the cell. He was just looking.
It was while observing the birds of the Galapagos Islands that Darwin made his most famous discovery. He counted 13 different types of finch on separate islands, some with long beaks, some with short ones, all sorts of variations. He wondered if nature had, over generations, adjusted the finches in varying ways to cope with their surroundings.
He began to come up with the idea of natural selection, that species tend to perish
if they're not well adapted to their environment, and they tend to thrive and reproduce if they are.
It was, Darwin reasoned, the survival of the fittest, or the swiftest, the one with the longest neck or sharpest beak. Over thousands and thousands of years, that was the way species evolved. Darwin kept researching until he was 50. In 1859, he finally published Origin of Species, which laid out his theory of evolution. The book sold out in a day, and the controversy began. In 19th century Victorian England, the book of Genesis was gospel, and the gospel said that God created Earth's creatures. Evolution seemed to fly right in the face of the Bible. The commotion would only grow louder when Darwin announced that the human species was a product of the evolutionary process too. That man was descended from apes and monkeys was an almost unthinkable notion in Darwin's day.
The concept of the thought of evolving from some substandard creature, or what you think to be substandard, is almost an insult to people. And, you know, a lot of people don't want to hear that. And sorry, but that's the way it is.
Today, Darwin's ideas are widely accepted, and yet they remain controversial. For they permanently dethroned man from his central place in the history of the Earth.
Go now, because I've realized essentially, look, Darwin was wrong. I've got to get these gloves back to a gorilla.
His father wanted him to be a lawyer and was appalled when he became a priest. But this simple German friar would transform the way we look at faith, and by extension, society itself. Martin Luther.
The leader of the Protestant Reformation. I mean, he changed the world. I just assumed that he would, if not be number one, certainly in the top 5.
Martin Luther's story begins with a crisis of faith. He was sickened by the corruption and greed of his fellow priests, and he was overwhelmed by guilt for his own sinfulness. He prayed and fasted for days on end. Finally, he had a revelation. Only by faith can man reach salvation, he decided. Not through donations to the church, not through a priest at all, just through devotion to God and his mercy.
The church was saying, you need the priest, you need ceremonies, you need to use the church in order to attain salvation. Luther said, no, we cannot accept religious belief from others. Unless you have faith, unless you feel the faith within you, you cannot be saved.
With Luther, it's a gigantic shift of authority from other people to the individual. You're not given the keys to salvation. You find them for yourself.
Luther even began to translate the Bible from Latin into German so that all could read it.
Changing religious practice from an obscure, ancient, dead language, Latin, to the vernacular, to your own living language, English, German, French, Dutch. It's a kind of repossession. I mean, it really lets you own your belief.
The conflict between Martin Luther and the church came to a head in 1517, when Luther decided to take a stand. He attacked the Catholic hierarchy in a diatribe called the 95 Theses. Legend has him hammering the document to the front door of the local church. Luther was dragged before an assembly in the German city of Worms. When he refused to recant, he was declared a heretic and excommunicated. Soon after, Luther gathered his supporters together and established the first Protestant congregation, breaking off in protest against the Catholic Church.
The central idea that there is no longer a homogeneous Western Christianity, that is an immensely important idea, a liberating idea. It's an idea that leads people to believe they can fashion their religion in their own way, and the proliferation of sects and individual oddballs and strange ideas in the years following Luther's revolution is quite extraordinary.
Extraordinary, yes, but explosive as well. Although the Reformation broadened people's individual and intellectual freedoms, it also led directly to the 30 Years' War, one of the bloodiest in Europe's history. But despite the carnage that ensued from the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther holds his position on our Millennium Countdown because he eloquently defined man's ability to relate directly to God.
I think Luther's statement at the Diet of Worms, "Here I stand, God rest my soul, I can do no other," is in many ways the core statement of conscience that underlies all modern democracy.
Number 2 on our list would have been unhappy to be second to anybody. He was an eccentric, insecure man who was abandoned as a child. He once threatened to kill his stepfather and burn his house down. In later years, he would grow violent defending his work and would even suffer a nervous breakdown. Yet looking back over the millennium, no one can dispute the importance of this man, Sir Isaac Newton, founder of modern science, master of mathematics and physics.
I think Newton is the greatest scientist of the millennium, up there with Galileo, Darwin, and Einstein. But Newton probably had the most influence. He was the person who put together mathematics, physics, and the universe and helped us see what science can do.
Life on Earth was not the same after Newton compared with before. If he didn't exist, it would have been another 100 years before someone would have done what he contributed.
Isaac Newton was a farm boy from the rural English town of Woolsthorpe, whose innate intelligence and curiosity were recognized early on. He studied at Cambridge, but when the bubonic plague struck England in the 1660s and cities were evacuated, Newton returned home, and that's where it all began.
He left Cambridge and went to live in the countryside, where he devoted himself to meditation and mathematical experiments. And it was during this that he did his monumental work on the laws of motion.
Sitting in an orchard, Newton saw an apple plummet from its tree and wondered why it fell straight down toward the center of the earth. From that simple observation, he extrapolated the laws that govern the Earth's gravity, the orbits of the planets, the positions of the stars.
He was in his teens and just barely in his 20s, where he then sort of single-handedly deduces the laws of gravity and laws of optics and laws of motion. That is sheer brilliance.
He devised a complex new branch of mathematics almost as an afterthought. We now know it as calculus. Almost every problem of higher engineering or physics is built upon the foundation of Newton's calculus. And it's indispensable for plotting the movements of planets and the paths of spacecraft.
You guys are up there, and who's driving? That's a good question. I think Isaac Newton's doing most of the driving right now.
We couldn't have gotten to the moon without Sir Isaac Newton. We wouldn't have gotten there. Here is a fellow that hundreds and hundreds of years ago came up with these laws of physics that have endured for so long. I mean, he's the guy that taught us what makes the world go round.
The impact of his work is staggering. Just look at the other names on our list who owe him a debt. If it hadn't been for Newton, the Wright brothers would never have gotten off the ground. Henry Ford's Model T would be up on blocks. Edison would still be sitting in the dark, and Bill Gates would be building a better abacus. Newton didn't start the scientific revolution, but he took the discoveries of those who came before him, like Copernicus, Galileo, and Descartes, and increased their significance many-fold.
Newton has a wonderful phrase. He says, "They may be giants and we may be pygmies, but we stand on the shoulders of giants and we can see further." Newton finally made it clear that science is here to stay, that you can't attack science anymore as mistaken or wrong-headed or evil or simply unnecessary. He made science central to Western thought.
The scientific age that Newton ushered in is so much a part of our lives today, we often take it for granted. But it was his groundbreaking theories of light and motion, mechanics and gravity that would eventually make science accessible to everyone. Finally, we could comprehend our planet and take our newfound understanding to the edges of the universe.
Politicians and statesmen often get the day-to-day headlines and the limousines and the jets. But over time, the people who make the most difference in our lives are usually the discoverers, the scientists, the people who made the great breakthroughs.
1,000 years. Scientists and kings, artists and even madmen. We've met them all on our list. Now we reach the top, the #1 choice of our panel, the person they picked as the most influential of the past 1,000 years. As always, our experts did not exactly speak with one voice.
I thought about how you define influence. Who did something that was both helpful and essential? And that's how I came up with Copernicus.
There's no doubt in my mind, and no question, that Isaac Newton not only belongs in the top 10, but if I had a vote in it, he'd be #1.
Newton and Copernicus were bona fide geniuses, but our panel's #1 person of the millennium was a hard-working German tradesman born 600 years ago. He wasn't a brilliant philosopher or theorist. He wasn't even a very good businessman. But he was persistent and ingenious, laboring for years to perfect one invention. The invention was the printing press. The man, Johann Gutenberg.
Gutenberg would be surprised, I think, to be #1 because he was not a genius. Newton knew he was a genius. Copernicus knew he was changing the whole way we looked at the world. Gutenberg was sort of a tinkerer, a shopkeeper, somebody who puts together something, and yet the inventing of the printing press, even if it isn't the great genius who does it, transforms our society perhaps as much as the theory of gravity or the theory of calculus.
When Gutenberg printed 200 copies of the Holy Bible in 1455, it marked a turning point in our civilization.
Before Gutenberg, if you wanted news, it almost always was oral. The only communication, if you lived in some village somewhere in Europe, the only time you ever heard anything about the outside world was not because a letter or a book arrived. It was because someone arrived. Someone came and brought news.
Printing was not a new idea. The Chinese and Koreans had used wood and metal type to print, but the process was slow and unwieldy. In the West, most books were hand-copied by monks, but a single volume might take months to produce. Gutenberg's breakthrough came when he combined earlier printing techniques with a new design for movable metal type. Then he put it all together with a press similar to one used to make olive oil. And with this, printing history was made. Gutenberg would continue in the printing trade until his death, but he was always short of money. In fact, when his splendid Bible appeared, all the profits went to his creditors. Yet, what Gutenberg wrought was astonishing. Within 50 years, 20 million books had been printed in Europe. In another 100 years, that number increased tenfold.
We evolved from being a society that was all city-states and villages that didn't communicate to being a global society in which all information could be communicated. That starts with the printing press.
Gutenberg's breakthrough helped Renaissance thought to flower and spread, and Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation to attract new followers. Then came the scientific discoveries of Descartes, Galileo, and Newton, and of course, the Industrial Revolution. News of technological breakthroughs, innovations in politics and the arts, all spread swiftly through newspapers, pamphlets, and journals. Gutenberg's printing press unleashed the power of ideas, and in many ways, his information revolution is only just beginning.
Gutenberg allowed us to transmit information so much more easily and freely. That continues through the current day, through the invention at the beginning of the century of radio, then of television, then of the internet and email. It begins with Gutenberg, and it's a 500-year process.
Over the past 5 centuries, that information has altered the face of history. Power left the hands of the elite. A literate middle class was born. And all around the world, authoritarian states have found it more and more difficult to keep their citizens in the dark.
Governments may say, don't print this in the newspaper, don't pass this information around, but it's all being faxed around. You can't hide that much from the people anymore.
The effect of the press on our lives is essential. We can't, as a democracy, live without it. It infuriates us. There's lots of bad press. But I've seen the opposite. I've lived in the Soviet Union in the bad old days. I've seen the effect of a non-press on a people. And if that's the option, then I think every American would say, count me out.
I think what the printing press does is it makes democracy more inevitable. Because when people have ideas, when people have information, people will have power. That's what the French Revolution is about, the American Revolution is about. And what happens in the years from Gutenberg's inventing of the printing press to today is the gradual growth of democracy, freedom, liberty, and personal empowerment. You don't have that if you don't have the printing press.
So much of what defines our millennium would never have happened without Gutenberg's printing press and its astonishing ability to get the word out.
If we had no Gutenberg, we wouldn't have had Shakespeare. If we'd had no Gutenberg, we wouldn't have had Karl Marx. If we'd had no Gutenberg, we wouldn't have had Albert Einstein.
Virtually every person on our Millennium list of 100 owes a debt to Johann Gutenberg. Consider those who wrote and published their theories and ideas, like Darwin and his Origin of Species, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, even Hitler's Mein Kampf. Were it not for Gutenberg, they might not have been inspired to greatness or infamy by reading the works of others, and their own thoughts and ideas would not have survived beyond their own lifetime to influence future generations. Artists like Michelangelo or Picasso, Beethoven or the Beatles, scientists like Marie Curie, Alexander Fleming, or Sigmund Freud. Their creations and discoveries have been reproduced on the printed page, broadcast on radio and television, and are now available to whole new audiences via the internet, thanks again to the printer from Mainz, Germany. It's hard to imagine who may be the #1 person of the next millennium, but there's no doubt they too will owe a great debt to Johann Gutenberg.
Without Gutenberg, I would say that we wouldn't be entering the next millennium. We would now be contemplating what it would be like to reach the 1600s. We would be 500 years behind our time.
And so we come to an end. 100 lives for 1,000 years. Of course, our list is only a beginning. So many remarkable figures were left off, so many creative geniuses and world leaders. In the end, though, the point of this list is not any one individual name, but all of them together, the whole list itself. For it reminds us of the heights and the depths of which we are capable. It shows us the ways that one human being can make a difference, that one life can influence the world for all time. From the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England, here's wishing you a Happy New Year. I'm Harry Smith. Good night.
The Strong Enterprise Fund. Past performance is no indication.